All right, so we're going to turn our attention to Module 45 and look and divide out into specific subsets some of the behavior that contributes to antisocial relations, and then in 46 we'll look at prosocial relations. And specifically, some of the roots of antisocial relationships really are found in prejudice or prejudicial attitudes, if you will. And then also stereotyping and a variety of other things. But specifically, let's just talk about prejudice first and define some of these things. When we talk about prejudice, the roots of the word obviously have a lot to do with prejudging. And prejudice itself actually has three different component parts. First, there is the belief set components. Oftentimes falls into what we might call overgeneralized or stereotypical beliefs about other people. I remember having worked for a period of time in the inner city of Chicago, and I found myself reacting to young black kids on the corner as if they were all thieves and going to attack me because I was a white person, and that showed up some of my stereotypical beliefs. So they're overgeneralized, they are stereotypical as well. A second component part is also involves emotions, and emotions come in a variety of forms that are related at least to other groups. Emotions would include hostility, it would include envy, it might even include fear. And we'll talk a little bit about the just world phenomenon in terms of the haves and the have-nots, but fear is another component part of these emotions that typically are found around prejudice. And then the last part, the third component, is predispositions to action. And what that essentially means is that given the group that I'm in and the way that it sees to act, given the group that I'm in and the way that they see the world outside of our particular group, will depend in large part between, will predispose a person to act in a particular way. Many of the more dramatic plays, if you will. Think of Shakespeare with Romeo and Juliet, the haves and the have-nots, the Capulets and the other family's name, which escapes me right now in Romeo and Juliet. There are predispositions to act toward other out-groups of people compared to the in-groups of people. So if we're going to make the actual distinction between attitudes and behavior, one might say that prejudice itself is an attitude, and discrimination is the negative behavior that accompanies it. And ultimately, we live in a world where there is a lot less overt is behavioral. We live in a society today where there's a lot less overt discriminatory practices and language, much different than times gone by. But essentially what's happened is that it's just gone underground. It has become less overt, essentially. So judging by what people say, overt prejudice has decreased dramatically in the last 50 years. However, subtle, like I just mentioned about myself in the inner city of Chicago, implicit or automatic prejudice is more prevalent. And so in a sense, it has gone underground in the world that we live in today. and it doesn't mean that we've necessarily changed our take on that. Now, the reason that I have this particular graph up here is that our attitudes, particularly when it comes to interracial marriage, has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. As you can tell, the support for interracial dating in 1987 for those born before 1928 was only 30%. It was in the 60% range for people born 46 to 64, and then it goes even higher until we're in the 90s now with those born after 1977. So those are key component parts that say something about our attitudes about interracial marriage and interracial relationships, say something about our prejudice or our overt versus covert or more hidden forms of prejudice itself. Interesting things have been discovered even in research. For example, people's facial muscle responses is often reflects some of their prejudice and in the activation of their actual amygdala. So we have not only facial expressions that oftentimes betray a person's prejudicial attitudes, but we also have neurological levels of activation that often betray prejudicial attitudes. And that makes sense. The interaction of the mind with the body is very well known. I got to spell that right. Activation is very well known, and so the amygdala is heavily involved in our emotional limbic system, and therefore we will activate. Whoops, I hate it when I don't spell right. So it makes sense that all of our body gets into the act, if you will. It confirms or disconfirms, and of course, if it disconfirms it, then we're in a state of cognitive dissonance. A few other bits of information. Researchers have found that 9 in 10 white respondents took longer to identify pleasant words, such as peace or paradise, as good when presented with black-sounding names rather than white-sounding names. We've got a element here of priming where we hear a person's name, basically judge it based on their ethnic background, and then have certain perceptions that come along with it. Remember, priming is helping somebody, in a sense, priming the pump is the phrase that we would use, where you're kind of set up to respond in a particular way because of the circumstances. So needless to say, priming people with a flashed black face rather than a white face also makes them more likely to perceive a flashed tool as a gun. So that what's in that person's hand, if it's a white person versus a black person, betrays some of the implicit learning that comes and shows up in our attitudes toward different races. And implicit learning is nothing that is told us directly. It's something that oftentimes is learned through modeling and so forth. So the social learning model comes into play when we're talking about this itself. The other phenomenon that fits into this whole scenario, if you will, is something that is oftentimes referred to as the just world phenomenon. And essentially, we have a variety of divisions amongst people. We have people that are fairly wealthy. We have people that do not have much money at all. And the just world phenomena reflects the idea that good is rewarded and evil is punished. Now, good has to be defined. So good rewarded, and evil punished. And oftentimes the particular groups will define what each of those terms basically are. So when some people have money, power, and prestige, and others don't have that, the haves, the people who have that, usually develop attitudes that justify things the way they are. What's fascinating to me is that even particularly in the Christian world, in the Christian worldview, you often don't see that, is that when people have a Christian commitment and a vibrant, vital relationship with Christ, what you see is that they don't justify evil in the world. As a matter of fact, they don't roll over to it, but at the same time, they don't see it as something just to leave alone. As a matter of fact, we're basically really called to be forces for good in the world around us, and the Christian worldview and even the Christian faith prompts and has prompted a variety of learning institutions, not to mention health institutions, that throughout the world and throughout human history that have been part of that. So you don't necessarily see as much of that. One of the other phenomena that goes along with this, which oftentimes you see in much of our thinking, is something that actually I spent a lot of time talking about in my crisis and trauma class, and it's the blame the victim kind of stance or attitude, if you will. And essentially what we look at when something goes wrong is we look at the victim as having some hand in their abuse, which is absolutely ludicrous on its surface, but at the same time, because of whatever level of intimidation we might have because of who the abuser is or their status or any number of things, that may come into play in how we judge the situation. And so because we love, excuse me, we love to have something that we refer to as cause and effect. And when we don't have a clear cause, then we go looking for one. And clearly the one person that's easiest to blame, if you will, are the people that are actually abused rather than the abuser. And that tends to come out in a lot of what happens when we talk about crisis and trauma and people that have been traumatized at the hands of other people.